So we're going to finish off actually Acts chapter 9 today, starting at verse 32, and we're going to go on through to the end. And I actually love it. I think it's a very appropriate story, especially around Thanksgiving, and especially given some of the things, current situation of things here this morning. I think how wonderful, what a great message for us to receive, to be able to hear from God. So why don't we just start by getting right into Acts chapter 9. If you remember, we were talking a lot about Saul and them, but now we're going to kind of shift back to what's been happening in Jerusalem. And so Peter decides he's not going to stay in Jerusalem anymore. He's finally going to take heed of what Jesus told him. And he travels about the country. He went to visit the Lord's people who lived in Lydda. If you don't know where Lydda is west of Jerusalem, not quite at the coast, but it's pretty close to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so he found a man named Aeneas who was paralyzed and had been bedridden for 8 years. And Aeneas, Peter said to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up, roll up your mat. And immediately Aeneas got up, and all those who lived in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now, this has always struck me as something strange about this story, especially if you follow along in your own Bible, and if you're looking at your Bible, we often subtitle all the little stories, especially in the New Testament, because it's kind of, especially the book of Acts, right? We got to remember what we're actually reading when we're reading the book of Acts, right? The Bible is a huge compilation of all kinds of different literature. If you're in the Psalms, you're reading poetry and songs, and there's a lot of imagery, and it's meant to be imagery. It's meant to help us to understand things through metaphor and simile, and it's meant to give us these beautiful images and help us to understand the majesty and the wonderfulness of God. We have things like dreams and the interpretations of dreams. We have apocalyptic literature. We have poetry. We have all kinds of different literature throughout the Bible. But when we're in the book of Acts, much like when we're going through the book of Chronicles, we're reading a historical account. This is a retelling of what happened in history. Right? And it's important for us to understand that when we're in here, because this isn't one of those things where we're going to sit down and debate whether or not, what does this mean? Does this mean this wonderful thing? Like when we talk about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamt about in the book of Daniel, or what does the vision that John saw in the book of Revelation truly mean? This isn't one of those things. This is this happened, and how incredible is this? And the reason I wanted us to understand this is because it can almost seem a little bit jarring. We have this one short little story in the Bible, and we go, why is that? And I think it's because improperly, many, as happens a lot, sometimes we kind of remove things from it. And I think it's because this little action, as incredible as it was, making the lame man walk again, right? As incredible as that was, the reason that I think it's said with such brevity is because that's nothing next to what's about to happen. And in fact, it's only meant to show us why the people, as we'll read about in verse 36, that are in Joppa, hear about Peter nearby and go, if Peter is near, maybe we can do something. And so it starts in verse 36 saying, in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. And if you've been here with me before, I can't remember how long ago, it's been quite some time, but I have talked about this particular passage before. In Greek, her name was Dorcas, and she was always doing good and helping the poor. But about that time, she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in the upstairs room. This was, of course, a traditional way of preparing a body for burial. Lydda was near Joppa. They were actually very close together. It was like the next town just east from Joppa. Joppa was right on the coast. Lydda is right east. And so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, please come at once. Now, I don't know what they were expecting him to do, but they were just, they were desperate. They were desperate for something to happen. So Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken to the upstairs room. All the widows stood around him, and they were crying, showing the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. And I love this, and we have to take note of what he's about to do. Peter sent them all out of the room. He doesn't make a promise. He doesn't make some grandiose thing. He just sends them out of the room. Hey, I need the room. Then he got down on his knees, and he prayed. And then he turned towards the dead woman. He said, Tabitha, get up. And she opened her eyes. And seeing Peter, she sat up. So he took her by the hand, helped her to her feet, and he called for the believers, especially the widows, and presented her to them alive. And this became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. And Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. Why is this so incredible? We are literally on Thanksgiving weekend. A whole holiday, a whole celebration of gratitude, which is, of course, in complete contrast to what our society tends to celebrate today. We tend to really lean into entitlements. We feel like we should be given this thing by virtue of being born a human being, instead of actually being grateful for the many, many blessings that we have in this world today, the many blessings that God has given us, the many blessings that that society has been able to produce. Like, it's funny because I had this conversation with Claire the other day, and she said, well, why don't they just do certain things? Like, we were reading something in history. Why don't they just do this? It's like, Claire, the way for us to transport, like for us to, yesterday we went to Millbrook for Thanksgiving. For us to get to Millbrook and back in one day and spend hours is like a modern invention. This did not exist. This is an incredible transformation of the way that we think about the world. The fact that I can hop on a plane and be on the exact opposite side of the world in 24 hours is insane. A journey that would have taken months is now measured in hours. What a blessing. What a blessed time we live at today. And we should be grateful. Why do I say this? Because as we look at this particular story, as we see this amazing resurrection story, first the story starts off, it's like it just kind of dips its toe in the water. Oh, I'm going to make a lame man walk, as if that wasn't incredible enough. Peter walks up and was able, by the power of Jesus Christ, to command the lame man to be able to restore his strength in his legs and be able to walk. That is incredible. Absolutely incredible. It's also a beautiful picture, right? Because when you're going through the Gospels and you're witnessing the ministry of Jesus Christ as he's going from place to place and town to town and visiting and doing miracles, you're seeing these kinds of things happen over and over again, and you're like, wow, this is incredible. Jesus was just so powerful. Why? Because he alone is God. He alone has the power over sin and death. He alone can do these magnificent things. And then there's kind of been this lapse of time where not a lot has happened, mostly because the church as it was growing was basically just existing inside Jerusalem, right? This idea of the church spreading out has finally only just occurred and is just beginning to happen. And as Peter goes out, he begins to do the exact same thing. He's modeling the behavior that he witnessed from Jesus Christ. This isn't something new to him. He knows what it is. And I believe it is the sincerity of his faith and his knowledge of who Jesus Christ is, his faith in Jesus Christ. I believe it is totally and completely sincere. He really does believe Jesus is the Son of God. Now, why do I, and how do I believe that? Because if you were here a couple weeks ago, you remember I said these were not good men of faith, and I still believe that, right? When Jesus was taken to the cross, all but John disappeared. Right? All the others gave up on him. Oh, if you were the Son of God, why? I mean, how would he get arrested? Now he's crucified? There's no way this guy could be the one we were waiting for. We all are fools. Only John stuck by him all the way through. And it wasn't until the resurrection, which I'm sure if each and every one of us, can you imagine if there was someone that we were a disciple of someone, we followed them, they made some extraordinary claims, but then we watched them die. Yeah, I can understand how that would shatter our faith. But if then 3 days later, we saw them suddenly standing here in our midst, wouldn't that transform your life? Wouldn't you go, wait a minute, maybe this person is someone I ought to follow. Maybe this person is someone I ought to put all of my faith in, because clearly they are someone that I am not. They clearly, they came back from the dead. And Jesus definitely made claims that he was God. Why is all this important? Because as Peter, sits down, right? And I love the contrast. In the first story, he just says to the lame man, get up and walk. And he does. But in this one, he does something different. And I think this is something that's important for us to understand too. I also want to contrast it to this. There was a story from back in 2019. I'll never forget it for as long as I live, because I feel like, and a lot of people feel this way, it made the church look really bad. Back in 2019, tragically, a young girl, I think she was only 2 years old, tragically she passed away. Her parents were believers, and they were believers at a big church down in the States, down in California, and they said, no, I know that Peter was able to bring life back by the power of Jesus Christ. I know Paul was able to resurrect by the power of Jesus Christ and bring back life, so we're going to do it too. And they started this whole social media campaign called Wake Up Olive. What is the difference here? For days and days, they had worship services and they prayed very, very publicly. They made a huge public spectacle of this entire event. Wake up, Olive. Tragically, in the end, of course, she did not wake up. God did not resurrect her. And that family eventually had to mourn the loss of their loved one. It was tragic, and it made a lot of people look at Christians in a whole different light. Whereas when I look at Peter, that's not what Peter did. Peter wasn't in it for the spectacle. He wasn't in it for the show. Even Paul, we're going to read that later on, it happens much later in the book of Acts. Even when Paul has his resurrection moment, it is much different than this. It is not about the spectacle. And it doesn't even matter your intentions. Maybe they intended to give God all of the glory for the resurrection. Maybe they wanted to show people the resurrection power of Jesus Christ. But that's not the point. The point is always, have you humbled yourself before God? Are you demanding something from God? Or are you going to God humble, putting yourself, submitting yourself below Him and saying, God, I'm under your authority. Your will be done. I trust in you. God, I would like to see this happen, but if it doesn't, I humble myself before you no matter what. See, I think we're only reading about this particular story. I bet you there were plenty of other opportunities, plenty of other things in Peter's ministry where he went before God and God said, no, not this time. Not this time. Why are we reading about this time? Because this time, when Peter went into the room, when Peter prayed, God answered. And God answered in a radical way. That means that we all hear about it today, right? Because what's it say? They called Peter. Peter shows up. And Peter says, I don't know, give me the room. And he goes in, he gets on his knees, and he prays. I think that's so important. He goes to God first, and he said, God, what should I do? Remember, we went through the book of Judges not that long ago, and I said you can see where the whole nation of Israel starts to fall off. It's when they stop going to God, and they stop getting on their knees, and they stop saying, God, what should I do? And instead, they, in their own wisdom, in their own power, in their own strength, they say, oh, I know what God would want us to do, and they just go and do it anyway. But that's not Peter. That's not what Peter modeled for us here. Peter models for us exactly what he saw Jesus Christ do. Even Jesus Christ, a member of the Trinity, the right hand of the Father, he humbled himself and prayed to God and said, God, Father, if it be your will, let these things happen. So he did. He got on his knees. He prayed. And whatever happened in that moment, God must have said something to him. He turned to her. Get up, Tabitha. And she did. But he doesn't call in the disciples. He doesn't call in the widows. He doesn't call in anyone else until after. Why? Because it's not about the spectacle. It's not about all of that. Peter doesn't take on the glory. Peter doesn't take on any of the credit or the claim. He just gives it back to God. See, sometimes in our lives, we put these demands before God. And in fact, I had one the other day. It was a friend of mine. And I know he was joking, but I always tell him, don't joke about these things. But he does it anyway. And he said, John, if God is real, he will make this and this happen right now. I don't even remember what it was. It was so inconsequential, but that was kind of the point. And then it didn't happen. He went, well, John, I guess that means that God's not real. And what I told him was this. No, what I just noticed from this entire experience was that the cosmic butler of the universe didn't show up and give you exactly what you wanted when you wanted, because you are not God. And you can't make things happen. You don't twist God's arm. We trust God. We trust his goodness. And maybe one day, we will be a part of something like this. I'm sure not one of those widows that were there mourning Tabitha that day thought that their story would be written down, that their experience would be written down, that it would be shared for all of us to hear and learn from, to understand. But I think one of the greatest things that the story shows us is God is good, and we ought to be grateful for that. On Thanksgiving weekend, what greater time for us to remember? God is good. We should be thankful for all the many, many blessings he's poured out in our lives. How many scrapes, how many things has God pulled us out of, and maybe we didn't even give him the credit for? I've mentioned the story about my broken foot in the past. Sometimes we'll just explain things away, but you know what? If we're honest with ourselves, we know that God has been with us. God has led us through so many things. God has poured so much into our lives. God has brought so much goodness into our lives. Even those that aren't followers of him. Why? Because we are all his children. He loves us all, and he wants us all to be redeemed. He pours blessings out on the entire world. Why? Because he wants us all to be saved. Not just the select few that have made that decision. He pours blessings generously on our whole world. And it's amazing to see what we've been able to do with those blessings. How the world has been utterly transformed since the time of Jesus Christ. And what his message, what his good news has done to our world and transformed it and made it better. On this Thanksgiving, I'm going to be grateful and remember gratitude again. Let us not fall into entitlement. Let us not fall into, well, God has to give me this because I did this. That's not how this works. Let us be grateful and understand how much God has given and how much God continues to give despite what we actually deserve.